Thank you. Thank you for that very warm introduction. It's truly an honor to be here. I've long been an admirer of the Society for the History of Czechoslovak Jews ever since I was a graduate student beginning my studies about Jewish life in Central Europe. I remember attending events at the Bohemian National Hall. Well, of course, it would be so wonderful to be there with all of you in person. I'm delighted that so many of you have made the time this evening to come to study together. My thanks to Eva Derman for this wonderful invitation to share the fruits of my research with you, and to Pavla Nikolova for making all of the technical and technological arrangements for this process as well. Eva, is everything all right?
Yes. We have many people here.
Yes, I'm really, it's so wonderfully gratifying to have so many people in attendance. And I'll just remind everyone once more that this lecture will take about 40 to 45 minutes. And afterwards, there'll be ample time for a Q&A, at which point we'll ask people, although we can't see you because of this webinar format, we'll ask people to please write their questions into the Q&A box. I won't be checking it in the middle of my remarks, but at the end, I'll scroll through the questions and try to answer as many of them as possible. I've also listed my email address here on this title slide. On the off chance that we don't have time to get to all of the questions, or people have comments, or I would welcome corrections as well. People are very, very welcome to get in touch with me at my email address, and the conversation can continue. Because this is very much a work in progress. Although, as Eva Derman has explained, this is a project that I have had an interest in for many years, long before the news of COVID-19 and the way our worlds have changed from it. Certainly this project has taken on new life, new urgency, new relevance ever since our lives have been changed globally by the onset of this pandemic. And not a day goes by where I don't encounter sources from the past with fresh eyes based on present experience. And I would welcome a conversation with anyone who would like to continue that discussion today. All right, our lecture now begins. The title of the lecture is Quarantine in the Prague Ghetto, Jews and Christians in Early Modern Death and Life. A traveler visiting the cities of Central Europe today, while passing through the spacious city squares that used to host markets and in the winter season still often do, might notice an odd structure if he or she stops to take the time. In many of these squares, a stone column stands in memoriam. Built before the age of nationalist wars and tombs of the unknown soldier, they do not pay homage to the fallen in battle, but rather they give thanks to divine grace in deliverance from a much more frightening threat, plague. These columns mingle civic commemoration with imperial pomp, Baroque craftsmanship with religious piety, all of which were constituent components of the cultural climate of Central Europe in the centuries following the Catholic Counter-Reformation. Like the rest of the continent, which experienced an outbreak of pestilence almost once a generation, during the period that historians have come to label the Second Pandemic from 1348 until the 18th century, the cities of the Habsburg monarchy lived under the regular threat of disease. The Habsburg lands comprised a considerable land empire that reached from the Italian Alps to the Ottoman Empire, and the Habsburg Empire was unluckily placed in migratory paths that made it especially susceptible to contagion. Epidemic ravaged the city of Prague. I'm just going to pause for a moment. Epidemic ravaged the city of Prague numerous times over the course of the 17th and 18th centuries, the topic of our discussion today. It attacked the city in the year 1649. Another major outbreak came 30 years later in 1679 or 1680, spreading from the Balkans through Hungary and onward to the southern and eastern German lands, which then included Bohemia and Austria. A testament to the monarchy's self-awareness of its role in public health was the establishment in the early 18th century on its eastern frontier of a sanitary cordon against the incursion of disease from Ottoman lands. In the summer of 1713, one such epidemic struck the city of Prague. There, deep in the Habsburg interior, the agents of the monarchy worked to establish a different sort of boundary line, one designed to separate groups of people from each other based not on region or health or illness alone, but according to ethnic and religious identity, carefully demarcating the lines between Christians and Jews. The plague first claimed its victims on the 20th of July in the summer of 1713, and by the time it had subsided, in late December of that same year, the Jewish community had lost some 3,703 souls to plague. An additional 2,071 had departed in flight, all of whom had come from a pre-plague population of 11,535. The Christian population of the city experienced death in similar numbers, but in smaller proportions of the total. From almost the first recorded symptoms of the plague that summer, health officials and municipal administrators worked to segregate Christians and Jews, prohibiting contact between domestic workers, shutting down the Jewish flea market, and specifically limiting Jewish mobility in and out of the city. Within a few weeks, while orders were being issued in Christian neighborhoods of the city to establish military garrisons and ensure the provision of food supplies, the Habsburg authorities were ordering the complete sealing of the Jewish town, barring all transit through its gates. Epidemic disease was, is, and as we know all too well, continues to be a part of life. Various great and small events of human history have had important outcomes determined by epidemics, be it the conquest of the Americas, the production of great works of literature, changes in laws, policies in healthcare, or in galvanizing movements for minority rights. One of the things that makes epidemics so noteworthy and remarkable is the fact that they are events. They have beginnings, middles, and even though it's more difficult to discern from our own vantage point, gradually come to an end. They tend to be highly visible, highly disruptive, immediate and widespread in the responses they elicit, even if we may debate whether those responses were immediate enough. They mount to a climax of crisis for individuals and collectives, and then they move towards closure as they peter out. As we're learning all too well in our own time, plagues are frighteningly, painfully disruptive of our lives. But they also throw our lives into sharp focus. They dull some aspects of it, they heighten tensions, they shine a light on acts of kindness, they bring some of us closer together, and others among us drift apart. No two epidemics are the same, and no two places encounter them in identical fashion. Different places, different social organizations, and perhaps most importantly, different past experiences lead to different responses. And so what I'd like to do today is not to offer any sort of comprehensive history of Jews and epidemic disease, which is a task that I would not be able to accomplish. It would be well beyond my capabilities. But rather, I'd like to try to use a moment of epidemic to reflect on larger themes, realities, and features of Jewish life in a particular time and place. I've taken this approach deliberately. I won't offer a clean or simple message or moral from reconstructing Jewish life in times of disease, but I'd like to suggest that we use one moment with all of its terror and loss, 6 months in the summer and fall of 1713, to seize a lens of perspective to think about the rhythms that propel our daily lives. I just want to pause for a moment because I'm seeing from some of the participants that they're having trouble seeing the slide. Pavla, can I ask you to tell me, just are you able to see the slide from your vantage point?
Yes.
You are.
Yes, yes, I see perfectly. I see just the slide and you on the right top corner. So.
And I do apologize to any of our participants. It may be a trouble with people's individual screens, and I'm hoping that as we move through the slides that they may become visible once again.
And sometimes it helps to maybe to leave and try to join again from my experience, but yes, I hope it will work.
Thank you. That's very good advice. Thank you. Okay, now to recap, we'll be examining one outbreak of bubonic plague, a disease which first struck Europe in 1348 and recurred at least once a generation until its almost complete disappearance from Europe after about the year 1720. And of course, the city that we'll be exploring is the city of Prague in the year 1713. In the early 18th century, communication networks were stronger than before, and an age with a rich print industry with strong Jewish communal structures. And that is the setting that we'll explore here. Now, as many of us in the crowd know, as many of us in the crowd here are familiar with, Jews had lived in Prague since the Middle Ages. The earliest textual evidence of Jewish life in Prague appears to come from a travelogue from around the year 965, from the mid-10th century, from the travelogue or diary of Ibrahim ibn Yaqub of Tortosa, a Spanish Jewish merchant who wrote in Arabic of his travels across Europe, observing the presence of Jews, as well as numerous others, in the city, though it's not fully clear if Jews were residents or merchants who passed through, travelers much like the author himself. Ibn Yaqub writes for us, the town of Prague is built of stone and lime and is the richest of towns in trade. There come to it Russians and Slavs from Krakow with merchandise, and from the lands of the Turks come Mohammedans, Jews and Turks, also with merchandise and with Byzantine money, and they export thence flour, tin, and various furs. Their country is the best of the northern countries and the richest in food provision. By the middle of the 12th century, we have far firmer evidence of Jewish existence there. By that time, Jews had built their famous Old Shul and soon started the construction of other synagogues to suit the needs of their community. They termed the next synagogue their New Shul to distinguish it from the old, and as the community continued to expand, the new synagogue ceased to be so new as it was joined by still more, with the new one receiving the moniker the Old New Synagogue, or Alte Neue Shul, still of great fame today, and it adorns the logo of the Society for the History of Czechoslovak Jewry as well, an apt and appropriate symbol for our society. By and large, Jews enjoyed the protection of rulers of the city. Charters were issued for their safety and privileges for them to live and work. Periodically, of course, violence broke out against the Jews, but this, by and large, punctuated moments of being at home. The 14th century was one of crisis and catastrophe across much of the European continent. The outbreak of the plague in 1348 had decimated the total population of the continent, perhaps by as much as 50%. And although the Jews of Prague did not experience major persecution in the immediate wake of the 1348 epidemic, violence flared in 1389, when riots broke out on Easter Sunday, which corresponded with the last day of Passover, historically a period of tension and religious competition. The Jewish community of Prague grew significantly in the 16th century, from a few dozen to over 3,000. And in the 17th century, Jewish settlement considerably expanded as a byproduct of events at the start of the 30 Years' War. At that time, the Catholic monarchy passed a series of laws designed to purge its lands of heresy, expelling and criminalizing Protestants. This expulsion vacated houses in Prague's wealthier districts, and nobles of the Catholic faithful left the crowded streets of Prague's inner city for more comfortable lodgings in the quote-unquote suburbs. Their place in the crowded streets were filled by Jews, who were given permission to purchase and occupy the houses. And by the mid-1620s, Prague's Jewish community had gone from a Jewish street to a Jewish town, a subunit of the municipality comprising about 20 streets surrounded by a wall. This town on the banks of the Moldau was walled off from the remainder of the city, and by the early 18th century, 6 gates formed points of access between the Jewish town and the surrounding neighborhoods. The Jewish town, as those of you who have been to the city know, is located roughly in this part of the city. And by the early 18th century, this Jewish town numbered approximately 11,000 residents who were crammed into 365 buildings. That's a very dense population, 11,000 residents in 365 houses or buildings. Observers noticed how densely packed these Jews were. In the 16th century, the English traveler finalist Morrison visited the city and remarked on his impressions of what he saw there after a 2-month sojourn. He observed that at Prague, and I'm reading from the quote is on the screen as well, at Prague, many families of Jews live packed together in one little house, which makes not only their homes, but their streets to be very filthy, and their city to be like a dunghill. Over a century later, in the year 1714, the Christian Hebraist and observer of Jewish life, Johann Jakob Schutt, similarly remarked on the tremendous overpopulation of the Jewish town, noting that in Prague, often 2 or 3 parties and entire households of Jews reside in a single large room, of which each a corner or nook inhabits, in which his table, cradle, and furniture are next to each other. The beds, however, in order to save space, are up in the heights of the room, like chicken houses, which they must crawl into and slip out of because they cannot stand upright. Habsburg imperial reports of the period similarly counted the Jewish inhabitants of most buildings as ranging somewhere between 20 and 40 to a building. And why am I telling you this? Because such conditions made the Jewish quarter particularly susceptible to the outbreak of disease. Jews were also part of mobile networks that stretched beyond the city. When the plague struck in the summer of 1713, a public health official and doctor by the name of Alexander Shamsky wrote a book aimed to establish the path of the plague into the city. The book was published in the autumn of 1713 as the plague was raging. And Shamsky linked the arrival of the plague itself not just to the cramped, unsanitary quarter of the Jews, but also to the arrival in the city of Jewish fur traders who had recently come from Poland, where the plague was then raging. When the first symptoms of the plague emerged, it appeared unexpectedly, however, and spread rapidly. The first patients were afflicted in the Jewish town on Thursday, the 20th of July, 1713, when plague suddenly struck a single house's 6 inhabitants. 4 of these 6 perished within 3 days, and the remainder within the next 2. And as word spread that plague had struck the Jewish quarter and threatened to engulf the city, Jews responded, as did most others, in time of plague. This response was captured in the conventional wisdom of a 17th century Hebrew medical manual, the Be'er Mayim Chaim, which advised that the first remedy for plague is to, quote, run away, far, immediately, and for a long time. This was part of conventional wisdom for Jews and Christians alike, actually since antiquity. It was part of a Latin phrase. The first response to plague is to flee. And indeed, for centuries, religious thinkers and policymakers alike debated the virtues or vices of fleeing from a city, an opportunity that was afforded only to those who had the means to do so. Those capable of flight indeed did leave the city, and an exodus of sorts ensued. Even the chief rabbi of the city, David Oppenheim, a figure close to my own heart, the subject of my book, and an insatiable book collector, abandoned the community, fleeing first to Hanover and then to Vienna. And with his departure, leagues of young men, yeshiva students from across the German lands in Poland and Lithuania also departed. One Yiddish poet reported on their flight from the city as follows, quote, "The elixir of life, which is the reward of Torah study, has escaped us. Death has begun instead." An entry from the Jewish court of the Kehillah, from the Jewish community of the period, shows the efforts that some Jews made to impose order on their lives, even in these first days of chaos. On the 7th of August, 1713, just over 2 weeks after the first outbreak of the plague, the Jewish communal ledger, or Pinkas, of the Prague Kehillah recorded the decision revolving around the case of a man named Anshel Wiener, who had planned to, or who was passing through Prague, rather. He was in flight from Eastern Europe and had passed through Prague and had intended to move onward, trying to keep one step ahead of the pestilence. Not a native of the city, leaving his home elsewhere out of fear, Anshel had stopped at the Prague court in order to avail himself of its instruments to make provisions for his family, to draw up a will in particular for his wife. Citing a passage from Ecclesiastes with foreboding, the passage reading, "For man cannot know his time," Anshel arranged for the transfer of all of his property to his wife in the event that he may die in the pestilence. Anshel gives us a sense then of flight in action, of attempts to impose and make order, of fear that one may lose one's life, and also planning for the future on behalf of one's beneficiaries. Now, with the first inklings of plague were discovered in the Prague Ghetto, Habsburg state authorities, that is to say municipal and imperial non-Jewish authorities, quickly stepped into action in order to contain and deal with this plague, both for its spread within the Jewish quarter and out of concern beyond. It evolved rapidly, though, and did not simply conform to any preformed models. An earlier epidemic from the year 1680 offered some precedents that were both to be followed and feared. That earlier outbreak had provided local authorities with a pretext to expel the Jewish community from the city, a fate that the Jews at that time only narrowly averted. In 1713, however, Jews in the city labored to actively intervene in the shaping of policies directed towards them, and with good reason. In the weeks immediately following the outbreak at the end of July, local Bohemian rulers began to discriminate against Jews in the Bohemian countryside, barring them from entry into or even from passage through the region, and thus bringing their commercial livelihood to a halt. At times, these obstacles were removed at the price of great sums, while at other times, Jews' material wares were confiscated. But Jews did not passively accept this treatment. Rather, the city's Jewish communal leaders lodged a formal complaint with imperial representatives in the Prague castle. And on the 3rd of August, their plaint succeeded in prompting imperial intervention, forbidding such action by local rulers. That is to say, the empire stepped in for the defense of Jews towards the end of the month of July and the start of August. Our story is not one simply of persecution, of fingering Jews as to blame, but rather of negotiating different kinds of responses. That imperial intervention forbade local rulers to bar Jews entirely and demanded that Jews be permitted access in and out of cities, likely in order to grease the wheels of commerce and maintain the economic health of the region, provided that Jews carried a clean bill of health, documents called health passes that attested to their status as local residents and as people who had not recently been to infected areas. The new imperial regulations also prohibited the imposition of new fees for passage through the region, denying local nobles or town owners the power to fleece these Jews and to exploit them unduly. Jewish records from the period similarly reflect the kindness that they believed they experienced at the hands of local rulers. These Jewish complaints likely found a sympathetic hearing on account of the state's need to balance public health against the financial needs of the realm, a perennial dilemma for cities during outbreaks of plague. As important economic agents across the Bohemian countryside, Jews' mobility was both then a benefit and a liability. Jews attempted to leverage their economic contribution, and states were mindful of the need to maintain commerce. Yet, imperial support for Jews' ongoing, albeit limited mobility, gave way to an almost total ban on Jewish movement as the weeks progressed. On the 17th of August, so almost a month into the epidemic, imperial authorities issued instructions for rural nobles to detain Jews and their goods for a 4-week period of quarantine under the open sky, before permitting them to onward travel as a means of staunching the plague's spread. And I was just reading the other day an archival document that talks about a former chief rabbi of the city who is stranded in an abandoned castle, who is trying to gain access back to the city of Prague, but cannot gain permission. And so he has decamped to an abandoned castle with numerous other poor, vagrant, and wandering Jews, all caught in limbo, not directly experiencing the plague, but experiencing the harsh measures of quarantine and restriction on mobility that separated families and pulled people apart. In the city of Prague, unlike in the Bohemian countryside, medical authorities immediately singled out Jews as carriers of plague. even when they did not subject Jews to direct persecution or violence. In fact, the very structure of the surviving sources from this time show us a kind of mental segregation by authorities that aimed to drive apart Jewish and Christian contacts. As Habsburg recommendations for the city were written, and here on the screen you can see this is a record from the Czech National Archives that I discovered years ago. There are boxes upon boxes upon boxes of German language documents in the Czech National Archives dealing with the plague entirely. But what makes them so remarkable is that virtually every document that talks about plague discusses first the plague conditions of the city of Prague in 1713 as a whole, and then dedicates special paragraphs to talking about, quote, particularly the Jews. Imperial and local policies reflect a kind of blunt distinction between the Jewish town and the other neighborhoods of the city. Whereas in other parts of the city, afflicted individual houses and buildings were sealed shut, a common practice across the European continent. I invite you to read Daniel Defoe's Diary of a Plague Year, Journal of a Plague Year, which talks all about the sealing up of individuals in houses. So whereas that was the policy for individual houses in the rest of the city, in the Jewish town, the entire Jewish ghetto was ordered sealed, regardless of how many of its residents had contracted the plague. Although the enforcement of this order was repeatedly delayed, which also tells us something about disagreements between municipal and imperial authorities about desire to allow some Jews to move while others desired to bar them entirely, ultimately the ghetto was sealed, which, as the order was delayed, provoked the flight of still more of Prague's wealthier Jews, leaving the Jewish town denuded of its elites, of its governing authorities, and advancing the state of panic. Because they understood the Jewish area of the town to be a primary source of contagion, state officials' principal approach was containment and separation. They neither actively intervened nor treated the residents of Prague's Jewish town, even as they did not seek to persecute, punish, or expel them directly. Jews were largely left to fend for themselves and were expected, as in so many other times, to provide for their own structures of welfare and compliance. The state called for the establishment of a Jewish commission to be led by communal leaders, which would wield enforcement power in case of violation. Non-Jewish doctors often refused to treat inhabitants of the Jewish town in the midst of the epidemic, a fact that the Jewish leadership brought to the attention of the city's authorities, albeit with only limited results. Communal leaders even struggled to find capable and willing members of their own community to oversee charitable collection or to provide medical attention to plague victims, to which we shall soon return. They repeatedly sought to enlist barber surgeons, which were the primary medical practitioners of the early modern healthscape, within the community to fill such roles, only to find that those barber surgeons soon had to be replaced when they in turn refused to undertake such high-risk tasks. And so Jewish residents rose to the challenge to various degrees. As noted, some of them fled. State records say that over 2,000 Jews departed the city, and witnesses within the walls report then on the grave misfortunes of those who were left behind. We have three different records written by Jews in the wake of the plague. Three separate Yiddish poems tell of the deaths in the tens and hundreds in a single day. In fact, I think I even have a chart for you of the scale of death. This is a chart that I put together of the scale of death in the city. Sometimes fewer than 20 deaths in a day, sometimes as many as 120 deaths in a day, with the dates running along the bottom there. I fear this is it's an uncomfortable message and an unpleasant one. I looked up the Hebrew dates that correspond to these dates, where I converted both the Gregorian and the Jewish dates. And I conjecture that the major spikes that we see in around the 13th or 14th of September, around the 24th of September, and the 14th of October largely correspond to an incubation period following moments of high holiday prayers, a period that we are, or that some perhaps in the audience are preparing to embark upon in the near future, although of course synagogues and houses of worship in many parts of New York City are making other accommodations, as they are on other parts of the planet as well. Three separate Yiddish poems then tell of this experience. They tell us of the bitter misery experienced by the Jews who were left behind. One reads as follows: "Now, dear God has opened my eyes to write to you of all the bitter misery that this caused me to deal with great suffering. So I must write for the sake of a remembrance, that by this we will remain engraved as a memory for us, how we sorrowfully were stuck in an evil affair, how God performed for us a merciful act and a marvel, so everyone should tell of it." The stories that we hear from the inside tell us that as the high holidays approached that autumn, the sounds of festival and mourning became so mingled and indistinguishable that it was impossible to distinguish the sound of prayer from the wails of sadness. A variety of communal responses accompanied these external pressures and policies and this environmental catastrophe. By the 16th of August, the Prague Jewish community had begun to coordinate a medical response. It obliged 3 of its medical practitioners by the names of Abraham Lesen, Leib Telch, and Berl Ben Chaim Yas to attend to the sick at any time they needed, regardless of social standing, both rich and poor. The poor, which included itinerant wanderers who'd come to the city fleeing the outbreak in other locales, though were hard put to find lodging. And the Yiddish poems tell us that people were housed in the communal bathhouse, an institution of the community with a 200-year history, and in what the Yiddish poems call bedlich, forms of barracks, sites that had become makeshift infirmaries and quarantines for the infected. But even these were often too small to accommodate the numbers of men, women, and children who sought shelter there. And so what kind of medical options then were open or available to Jews during the plague? We have a number of answers to this. The Jewish ghetto in Prague was home to an array of medical practitioners, including the barber surgeons that I've mentioned a number of times before, midwives, very important, and even apothecaries and pharmacists. As early as 1657, the medical faculty of the Prague University had labored to mandate that all medical activities by Jews be brought under the oversight and examination of the faculty there. And similarly, the Jewish community had worked to labor, control, and define the parameters of what doctors will do. On this slide here, you can see a manuscript of a contract for a communally appointed doctor from Prague. And the language of it discusses all of the duties, responsibilities, and even some of the contractual salary arrangements for locally appointed communal functionary doctors. Barber surgeons were an important part of the medical landscape of the early modern city. Unlike academic physicians who were educated in the university, surgeons, like apothecaries, usually received a kind of hands-on training through apprenticeship and guild membership. And they could also draw upon a growing, small but growing and significant body of books written for medical instruction in Hebrew and Yiddish. Material from Prague's Jewish community shows us a bit about this activity in action. Here is a book printed in Frankfurt am Main in 1700 that contains a variety of instructions and etiologies, that is to say, sources of plague. The one word you can see here in Latin characters reads pestilentia. This is a book of 10 different great ailments, and one of them appears here, written out in Hebrew, that gives instructions for the treatment of plague. Yiddish medical books similarly offered a kind of home remedy. Let me see if I can move myself out of the way. Offer different kinds of home remedies for dealing with plague. Here is a recipe, for example, for a tyriac, which was a kind of potion of sorts that was a catch-all panacea for a variety of different ailments. A Yiddish book from the period gives the recipe for it. It says, take a grestor or sour grapes and the juice of lemons, 1/4 mug each. Add to it crushed walnuts and grated white bread, as much as you want. Mix everything together and use it with meat. It is very healthy in these times. In the house, one should often kindle a fire because the flame consumes the bad air, especially when made with wood of the juniper and the like. Otherwise, one should fumigate the house with the berry of the juniper tree, hyssop, oregano, mint, rosemary, marjoram, basil, lavender, the peels of apples, and similar things of that nature. Now, I'm not fully convinced that someone in Prague would have access to all of these. It's quite likely that many of these ingredients were part of a kind of medical tradition that were copied from one medical textbook to another, regardless of whether those items were readily available. But Prague did have its own apothecaries, its own pharmacies. The apothecaries of Prague had a long history that reached back, well, less than 100 years, but still of importance. Before that point, Jews presumably had acquired healing materials from Christian pharmacists, of which there were a few in the city. But the rapid growth of the Jewish town in the course of the 17th century paved the way for a diversified economy among the Jews themselves. One such family, run by the Kish clan, had by the turn of the century secured a large space on the main floor of a house. The family likely lived in the upper floors, and on the ground level, a window faced to the street to receive customers. This wasn't a browsing enterprise, but rather you would arrive at the door and request, and the apothecary, him or herself, would go and reach from the shelves all of these different materials. In fact, one of the plague songs from Prague tells us a little bit about how difficult it was, but still the process of acquiring medicinal materials in the midst of the 1713 plague. The Yiddish poem tells us all the money was spent on the nurses, barbers, and apothecaries. They made arrangements for 200 beds for the poor, attendants and barbers, lemons and other food for poor people, as well as other medicines. Our communal money was spent on this. One should only have seen the scene at the apothecary. One could hardly enter for basic necessities. People had to wait for 3/4 of an hour before they could get in. And whoever wanted to acquire medicine at the apothecary or refreshment for the sick had to give great sums of money. One thought that he was keeping the sick alive. So we have a sense of the kind of chaos, the scarcity, and the long lines, 3/4 of an hour that one would have to wait just in order to get basic medicinal supplies. So we've seen a number of different sources that tell us about life there. We've seen letters that are written by imperial authority, or edicts, instructions by imperial authority. We've seen pages from Jewish-run courts and community records. We've seen Yiddish texts here, and I'd like to also turn to explore some of the ways that Jewish rabbinic literature from the period preserves questions received by rabbis that offer us a glimpse into the challenges of the moment and responses that Jews marshaled as they sought to balance tradition and crisis in the midst of a pandemic. Each of these three questions comes from, so I'm going to look at three questions with you, and each of the three questions comes from a member of the rabbinic court, a man by the name of Rabbi Jacob Reicher. Here are some of the questions. Here's the first. The question is as follows. In the year 1713, when there was a plague, a dever in Prague, I was asked by a man who was frightened and trembling that he had not yet fulfilled the commandment to be fruitful and multiply accordingly, and if it was permissible to serve the bed or not. Surrounded by illness and death, the questioner contemplated bringing life into the world. There's perhaps no greater investment in the future than children, yet what could be more frightening than the prospect of bringing vulnerable innocence into the world in the midst of danger? The question, as I read it, begs for balance between pausing the normal rhythms of life in the present while anticipating and imagining normalcy, preparing for a time to come. Moreover, more than just balancing present and future, the questioner may have been motivated by fear of his own mortality, a worry that he himself may perish in plague without fulfilling his religious duties in this world, thus compromising his immortal soul in the world to come. Now, the answer to the question forestalled procreation. It argued that really one should just wait, especially if one already had perhaps a child and wanted more. But he also noted that it was not an absolute prohibition. The rabbi wrote, quote, "Since it is only the measure of piety, it is permitted, since there are grounds to be concerned that if he does not serve, he shall come to sin, either him or his wife, if she yearns for him," end quote. Now, I think this last bit is remarkable because I think it suggests that the rabbi's analysis incorporated not only the technicalities of procreation, but the acknowledgement of sexual desire. It's odd to think of desire in the middle of a pandemic, and yet the rabbi weighed this very seriously. Although he framed his concern in terms of the avoidance of sin, presumably either fears of adultery or even wasted seed, His turn to sexual desire as an overriding factor acknowledges human sexual desire, both male and female, as deep, intrinsic, and motivating, and a force to be reckoned with, not denied nor ignored. But the onset of plague was also not solely a matter for deliberation about individual choices, but also affected community and the energies it expended during a time of scarcity and panic. The rabbi received another question that same year as follows. The question reads, question, a terminal patient who had instructed before his death that a certain sum of money should be used for the ransom of captives, and now that the noise of plague is in the world, may it be kept further from us, in the year 1713, and many of the people of Israel are in dire straits, is it permissible to give them this money, or is it a deviation from the intention of the donor? Now, the rabbi was at great pains to approve of the repurposing of funds without the express wishes of the bequeather. For the Talmud had established the ransom of captives as the most difficult of fates, more punishing than famine or the sword. And yet the rabbi argued that the Talmudic hierarchy was not entirely apt for his own time. He argued instead that the outbreak of an epidemic resulted in a form of captivity no worse than literal imprisonment. As the ghetto itself had been sealed by Habsburg decree that summer, the rabbi wrote as follows. They closed the Jewish street with none coming and none leaving, and at great pains by intercession, they were allowed to bring them necessary food. In some places, they had to go and hide themselves in forests and caves, and the people of Israel were on the roads and in the fields, abandoned to die. There is no greater captivity to this than this. Reicher thus confidently ruled that repurposing funds from the ransom of captives to the support of the besieged by plague and persecuted by government discrimination was by no means a deviation from the will of the donor, as there is no greater captivity, and that the money could be turned to communal collective relief. He, of course, was not wrong that authorities had attempted to segregate Jews, and this had caused great misery and misfortune for many. Nor was he wrong that people were relegated off to the countryside. We see the extreme measures in still one further question after this, a question from the same year. At the time of the plague may be kept from us in the year 1713, when the sovereign, his highness, instructed in one of the places that one was not to bury the dead in the cemetery of their fathers, that is, in the city, without first pouring lime upon it to decompose, and if not, to bury him in one of the forests in which there is no human settlement, which is preferable. We have evidence of this actually from a variety of sources. Some of the very earliest documents that were issued by the Habsburg monarchy that year gave instructions for sending bodies down the Moldau, where they would be buried in an auxiliary cemetery, and demanded that those burials be buried at night rather than during the day, be buried swiftly, and be buried deep in the ground, and again, only after a decomposing lime powder was put on them to accelerate the decomposition of the body. The rabbi had to weigh different concerns here. He had to weigh present against future, the dignity of the body, the integrity of the body, and more. And although he acknowledged that the accelerated decomposition was an indignity, he concluded as follows, quote, in our case, it is preferable to pour lime upon him to be buried in the burial neighborhood, that is to say the cemetery, and not to bury him in the forests like the burial of a donkey without guardianship, for it is possible that there the dogs will dig him up and carry him off and the like. The answer to me is simple. The rabbi's instructions about burial, then, may have been linked to ongoing ritual importance of cemeteries, not only for the moment of burial, but rather as a site that was central to the ritual life cycle of living Jews as well. The particular importance of the cemetery as a site of commemoration persisted for years to follow, and is evident from the publication of a small pamphlet printed in Prague some 4 or 5 years after the end of the plague in 1718 or 19. The pamphlet comprised a Yiddish prayer, or tchine, entitled A New Tchine for People Who Perished in the Plague. It belonged to a genre of writing dedicated to and directed towards Ashkenazic women's spirituality and ritual activity of the early modern period, a larger genre called tchines, prayers for women's devotion. The most famous of these, called the Three Gates by a Sarah Bastovin, relate a centuries-old custom of measuring the cemetery tombstones with candle wick and then preparing candles during the high holiday season, usually lighting them before the Day of Atonement or Yom Kippur. This new trina for people who died in the plague may well have been designed to accord with this custom. In this very slim, it's about a 5-page publication, the female reader of the plague was directed to ask God for forgiveness for the speaker's inability to identify properly the graves of the lost, to commemorate the anniversary of death with precision, and moreover, for her failure to weave a burial shroud for the unknown deceased, and to accomplish the array of other last rites that the deceased from plague deserved. The text referenced a number of aspects of the Yom Kippur prayers, with references to the prayer from the Yom Kippur liturgy of 10 martyrs at the time of the destruction of the Second Temple in antiquity, and the harrowing prayer Unetane Tokef, which proclaims acceptance of divine judgment, even as the reader begs forgiveness and intercession from the departed on her behalf, because we, Israel, are responsible, she writes, for each other, for the sins which we have done. In this, the prayer may also have been invoking a kind of understanding that the people who had perished in the plague were martyrs of a sort. Even though they were not killed at human hands, they may have been understood as kind of martyrs. And the publication of this trine 5 years after the end of the plague points to the long period of reckoning that followed the crisis for years to come. Now, this has largely been a tale of hardship and suffering, but before I conclude, I do want to also point towards the ways that plague can draw our attention towards moments of coexistence. One of these is the way in particular that Jews and Christians, whom it's easy to imagine as being at odds with each other, interacted in common, in daily fashion together. Among one of the very first orders issued when the plague broke out in late July was an instruction to prohibit Jewish and Christian women from doing their chores side by side, especially their washing for holidays, which suggests, if we read between the lines, that regular daily contact was a norm that had to be fought against, and fought against strenuously. It would otherwise continue apace. 2 weeks later, on the 7th of August, as the order to seal the ghetto was issued, a new edict came from the government, once again making strenuous efforts to separate people that otherwise maintained all kinds of forms of neighborly contact. The imperial offices feared the spread of contagion between Jewish and Christian homes, especially with the flight of healthy and wealthy Jews from the city, who had deposited some of their possessions for storage with their Christian neighbors. I've put for you on the screen here also regarding healthy Jews who retired from Prague. They deposited their objects and goods in the storage spaces in Christian homes. From the perspective of the state, this neighborly collaboration was unacceptable. But for we, observers of the past, it tells us that Jews and Christians felt a measure of solidarity, at least across class lines. That is to say, within the same class line. Well, in the 20th century, we have far too many examples of neighbors eagerly appropriating the homes and possessions of those who left materials behind. In early modern Prague, Jews appear to be exhibiting a trusting relationship, a willingness to leave possessions with neighbors in anticipation that they would be safely kept there. Now, I'm short on time, so I'll conclude. The plague's worst ravages abated by the spring of 1714, at which time the hard work of rebuilding began. When the worst of the epidemic had subsided, restoring order was more than just a matter of friends returning home to claim their dues. Rather, it required the concerted efforts of civil and Jewish administrators alike. One artifact of those efforts survives in the form of a record book, a compendium of 63 testimonies given by widowed women who survived the disease but whose husbands did not. The cover of the volume tells us exactly what we are seeing here. It is, quote, a new inventory and oath book, which the elders composed in April of 1714. The fact that its composers described it as new suggests it was a revival of a practice, an attempt at picking up the pieces of a documentary record-keeping culture that had been disrupted by environmental and social upset. And over the following 12 months, women who were widowed by the recent epidemic came before the Prague Jewish court to represent an inventory of their material assets to the leaders of the Jewish community, and to swear an oath that they had taken no part of these assets without prior authorization, a condition necessary for the court to guarantee that they would retain these materials for their ongoing survival. At the end of a year-long process, the registrar of this Jewish court entered each inventory and oath into a large bound volume that survives to this day, transcribed it into German, and created a record for both the Jewish administrators of the community and the civil authorities of the cities of Prague. And list after list of these accoutrements give us a glimpse into the material conditions of Jewish daily life. They show us clothing and jewelry, Sabbath clothes and finery, belt buckles, and also seats in the synagogue, stalls in the marketplace, the essential daily affairs that made up the lives of these women and their families. Through them, we can see the lives they had before and their attempts to rebuild new lives in the aftermath of the crisis. For indeed, life was rebuilt. In time, life in the city of Prague returned to the normal rhythms of what had come before. A Jewish traveler to the city in 1719 recorded the hustle and bustle in the Jewish town, noticing the fullness of its market, its synagogues, performances of cantors, nightlife and entertainment, street life, as well as its remarkable cemetery. Plague had receded, the absent voices, now just a memory. Yet its impact remained in writings and memory and legal traditions, challenges bequeathed to posterity, in recognition that having come in the past, plague could rear its head once more. The arrival of disease affected every facet of human life, from grand state policies about the movement of people to the composition of new songs and prayers, to the robbing of family members of children, loved ones, and supporters. Even as the Jewish population of the city came under special collective scrutiny, the edicts and orders of this operation cast light on the routine relations between different groups of people, allowing us to reconstruct the operations of daily life and reveal a nuanced picture, not of just inclusion or exclusion, but of managed and mediated interaction, of crisis and creativity, of accommodation and adaptation. May we, who are living through a pandemic in our own time, similarly have the strength to overcome and adapt in the days to come. And I thank you. Okay, now, if I understand correctly, we have some time for questions. I'm going to consult the Q&A here. I welcome people to enter questions. Number of wonderful, wonderful questions. So perhaps I'll begin with a question that asks me to reflect some autobiographical information. One of our questioners asks if I am of Czech descent and what drew me to this topic of research. My family is not actually of Czech descent, even though I carry the surname Teplitsky, which of course is a welcoming surname to have when I visit the archives in Prague and in the Czech Republic more generally. I was drawn not by any personal connection, but rather by how fascinated I was with the marvel of the city of Prague itself. Prague is, as I'm sure so many of you know, a city that in many ways has preserved its medieval and early modern buildings. One can get a feel walking through the city of what life must have been like in the 17th and 18th centuries. And similarly, the archival holdings of the city of Prague are rich and offer a reconstruction of Jewish life that in many ways is unparalleled in so many other places on the European continent. And so I was drawn to the city not out of personal biography, but rather out of intense curiosity for what the archives and the treasures of the city, textual, material, architectural, can offer us for a reconstruction of lives past. I was drawn particularly to this topic, actually in reverse order of what I've presented to you today. I closed with the widows and their inventories. That was actually a discovery that I made, I think in about 2013 or 14. I found this record book of women's inventories in the wake of the plague. And it immediately seized my excitement. It's so hard to recover women's history, especially for the pre-modern period. And I was fascinated by the fact that we saw so many of these women in action during this time, coming to court, working to retain their possessions. And that drove me to try to understand and want to figure out what the wider context was. And so I made a visit to the city of Prague and requested in the Národní archiv, in the National Archive, to see documents from the plague year. And they brought me box after box after box after box. And I thought, all right, I'll probably just be looking at these boxes to find out what was happening in the city more generally. And from the very first page of these documents, Jewish experience was reflected there. It became clear to me that the experience of Jews in the Jewish town was central to understanding the entire plague outbreak of this year. And I thought it would be interesting, and I do hope it will be interesting, to reconstruct just 6 months in the life of this city. This is a book that I'm writing as fast as I can right now to try to reconstruct 6 months during this plague, so that we can truly understand the individuals and their options and the choices and responses they made during this time. Some lovely questions about the etiology, about the sources of plague. Yes, indeed. So we think that this was an outbreak of bubonic plague. Bubonic plague, or Yersinia pestis, which was firmly established in the last decade of the 19th century, but really only in the past decade or so have historians come to largely agree in a consensus that the recurring outbreaks of plague were this plague bacteria, appear to have been caused by flea bites, transmission through flea bites that were carried on the backs of rats. But the sources from our period do not yet fully comprehend, or do not fully have a model for contagion working in this way. Two different models of how disease spread tended to coexist throughout the medieval and early modern period and into the 19th century as well. One was a contagion, a kind of infectious disease model, and the other was environmental, a belief that bad air could cause disease to spread. In fact, it was precisely for that reason that the responsum, the question that we saw about accelerating a body's decomposition, was mandated. It was believed that bodies gave off foul odors, and those foul odors were responsible for creating noxious or toxic air. And so this was seen as a public health measure in order to accelerate the decomposition of those bodies even more quickly. I should also note that at the same time as well, there were other beliefs that particular astrological seasons were important, or particular astrological configurations of signs. Certainly when the Black Death struck in 1348, a number of medical textbooks and treatises were written that argued that it was the particular configuration of the planets Mars and Saturn that caused this ailment, which also I think is interesting for our story in that Jews had long been associated with the planet Saturn. Jews in their Sabbatian, in their Shabbat, in their Saturday-oriented activities were associated with the planet Saturn, which presides over the seventh day. And so there's really a long history of Jews and epidemics to be built into that history as well. Let's try to pull some of the other questions in the limited time that remains. Yes, indeed. So I see a question here that says, burials ended in Prague's Old Jewish Cemetery in May 1787. The Zizkov Jewish Cemetery was temporarily used for plague victims in the 1600s and was called the Plague Cemetery. Precisely. The 1713 plague victims were not buried in Prague's cemetery that those of you who know the city well, they were not buried in the cemetery in the middle of town. That was explicitly forbidden. We have surviving documents from the period that talk about moving the bodies out through the gates of the city and funneling them down along the Moldau River so they could be buried outside of the city. So correct, they are not from the old Jewish cemetery, but rather the new, or the plague cemetery was the one that was answered, was the one that was used at this time. Let's see. Another questioner asks, out of curiosity, it appears that from the 3 questions posed that Rabbi Reicher acted more as a judge in the line of Moses than what initially thought would be his role during the Prague plague. Is this more in line of the role of a rabbi today? Did rabbis always serve in the role of arbiter or judge? Please advise. So it's a lovely question. Reicher was operating in 2 modes simultaneously. He was an institutional member of the rabbinic court. He was empowered to serve as a judge. And as we saw from some of the material in this plague, Jews and their communal leaders had enforcing power. They had the power to enforce decisions of the courts. Though I do believe that by and large in a number of the questions here, so I guess we'd have to distinguish between the ones that are for individuals, like the ones about sex and sexuality, for individuals to make their own decisions. In that regard, he was a rabbi consulting, and I don't know if the people who wrote to him took his advice or not. I don't know if they decided to have procreative sex. I don't know if they used contraceptives, some of which were available during their time. I don't know if they had successful pregnancies, and I don't know if any members of the family survived during the pestilence. But in that way, he was serving as a kind of individual decisor or interpreter of rabbinic law. But you're absolutely correct that at other times he appears to have given judicial legal cover for the community almost to seize the assets or to repurpose funds that were set aside for the ransom of captives and to redirect those to charitable or medical forms of health, welfare, and relief. So he really was operating as part of this Jewish pre-modern community that provided a whole battery of health and welfare services, and also courts and watchmen and coffee houses and shoemakers, and the list goes on. There was a whole Jewish economy in microcosm in the city of Prague, which really had a Jewish town unto itself with 11,000 inhabitants. It rivaled towns of its size. And in fact, in Prague, there were only about 40,000 inhabitants in the city at this time, which meant that Jews comprised a significant, still a minority, but a significant minority in the city at that. And so I think Reicher straddled the difference between the way we might think of rabbis in the 21st century and as an arbiter or judge with real executive coercive power in his own time. Let's see if more questions have come in. We're running a little low on time. Let's see. Very nice. One of the questions is, were houses sealed with the occupants inside, or were people given a chance to leave? Precisely, in some ways it really mirrors the stay-at-home orders that many of us, depending on the parts of the world that we are in, experience in our own time. Usually people were sealed inside, not in a manner that of course would suffocate them in any way, but as a way of quarantining, of sealing people off in the hopes or expectations, however macabre they are, that in sealing people away, at least everybody else would be spared from this fate. I do, once again, I recommend Defoe's Journal or Diary of a Plague Year from the Great Plague of London, 1666, which talks about the process of sealing houses. The e-text is available online, and it talks about how authorities would work their way through the city, closing up the windows and doors, making provisions for feeding people therein, but really sealing people off as the only kind of containment strategy that was active during this time. Sometimes people were actively removed from the city. They were taken to lazaretto, to plague hospitals, where the sick were all quarantined together. And the Habsburg imperial documents are very involved with setting those up. There were somewhere between 6 and 8 in different parts of the city of Prague, and Jews were certainly in those as well. But at a certain point, when those were overwhelmed, people were sealed up in their houses in order to just segregate or keep the sick and the infirm away from everyone else. You know, I'll confess, I actually, in terms of how did the archives survive the Holocaust? Well, okay, as I've, perhaps I should tell you just a little bit more about where I found these different materials. A significant part of this discussion here comes from the Narodny, from the National Archives, not from the Jewish Museum of Prague, although a wonderful collection of documents comes from the Jewish Museum in Prague as well, which means that a significant number of the materials there were preserved as part of the Czech national heritage and were not designated for particular focus during the war for destruction. Of course, the Jewish Museum in Prague is it's just a fascinating and wonderful institution. It is in many ways one of the first of its kind, and I'm not expert on this, so I hope I will not misspeak, and I can refer people to better documentation of the story of the Jewish Museum of Prague. But it was founded in the late 19th century and was an early Jewish historical society dedicated to the preservation of, the enlivening of, and the explanation of Jewish culture to Jews' non-Jewish neighbors in Prague and the Czech Republic more generally. And to a very large degree, the vast majority of the collections there, through different heroic efforts, managed to survive the war and are vital, vital sources for the reconstruction of Jewish life and, dare I say, for Prague and Czech life beyond just the Jews, for understanding the totality of the city's experience. I'd be happy to direct people to sources and stories about the Jewish Museum in Prague, a heroic institution that suffered first during the interwar and during the war period, and had challenges, of course, during the communist era as well. I see another question. Questions about widows' property oaths. Was the legal assumption that a widow obtains a deceased husband's property and not their male children? Thank you for asking that question. Thank you for asking that question. The reason I think that the women had to come and make their oaths was precisely to navigate between those competing claims. Very often the women had to articulate that they had brought those aspects brought those assets into the marriage, and therefore they would not move on to the husband's heirs, i.e. his children, but rather were items that the women could retain. A recurring phrase in many of them is the, oh dear, now I'm going to forget the exact name. One of the particular assets that the women refer to often is a kind of bridal gift that they received. And the stipulation of that bridal gift, a gift from their wedding night, is that would belong to them. It would not become part of the woman's common property with the husband, in which case it would pass to his heirs, but instead belonged to a preserved, carved out subsection of that widow's properties. In fact, in pre-modern Europe, the most economically independent women were widows, because they were the ones who had a kind of distinct and independent economic life from the husbands, preserving some of their materials, having a share in family business. But your question actually answers the question wonderfully, which was the very reason that they had to offer the oaths was to carve out that space to defend their property from the incursion and claims of other heirs, or importantly as well, from the state, from the government taking those assets under the assumption that they belong to the deceased and now could be claimed by state authorities. Let's see, another question comes in. What was the Jewish population by the time the plague ended in 1714? I don't have a head for numbers, but I do keep notes of the numbers, and so I'm happy to offer those your way. Records from the period tell us that the pre-plague population of the Jews, Trousseau, thank you, the pre-plague population of the Jews was 11,535. And we know already by December of 1713, a state-run census suggested that the community had lost 3,703 souls, had died, and an additional 2,071 had departed. So that's upwards of half of the population from death and loss, but many, many, many people returned from that. So I think we're looking at between a quarter and a third of the Jewish population passed away. I wasn't totally sure that I wanted to trust the government reckoning or the government census. So I did a comparison between the state census and a record that was kept in one of the Yiddish handbooks, one of the Yiddish narratives. And they actually, the numbers line up within about 100, which suggests to me, it's possible that they're both wrong, but it suggests to me that there is a faithful reportage between both, and that the numbers are not being exaggerated or underestimated on either side. Let's see. Another question asks, the research suggests that women were more likely to survive than Jewish men. I'm not quite certain of that. If my research or if my presentation has suggested that, then now is my time to offer something of a corrective. First, I'll begin with a particular research agenda of mine. It's important to me in telling these stories to labor as best as I can to make sure that I am recovering the voices of women and discussions of gender that are so easily lost to historical analysis. And so if I've placed extra emphasis on women's lives, it's in an effort to restore, to make up for how often and how difficult it is to find both women and men in the historical record. It also comes from my genuine excitement with having found them. I'm so thrilled with it. I felt I wanted to share them with you here. There is some measured evidence that does suggest that mortality rates were lower among women than men, though it's difficult to substantiate that. I think that rather the answer is that in the case of the widows, for example, they appear in the legal record because they needed special circumstances in order to lay claim to their possessions, whereas men would not have needed to defend their possessions. The women need to defend their possessions from other heirs, from the government, etc., which is why they appear in the documents. Because they are somewhat extraordinary, we have greater evidence from them. Whereas men who don't need to make the same kind of defense of their assets don't need the same kind of court proceedings and the production of records for them. So I suspect that that's the reason. So both, my own decision to highlight women's stories for you, but also the extraordinary circumstances in which women needed to go to hold on to their assets, tell us about the preservation of both of their lives there. Now, I think just in the name of sparing people with Zoom fatigue, perhaps we should take this moment to bring our proceedings to a close. It has been an absolute honor to share this work in progress with you. I thank you for your attention, for your questions, for your engagement. And as I say, I'd be delighted to continue the conversation into the future with anyone who wishes to get in touch with me.